Hi, everybody. So my name is Gueltekin. I'm a researcher at the Innovation Value Institute, part of the research going on in the digital retail research cluster. And what I'm going to present to you now is part of a result of my scoping review, which I did in the beginning of my PhD journey. So it's dealing with the industry and the structural perspective of the current developments in the whole retail industry. And it developed to a paper, and that paper was also presented at the European Academy of Management last year. And my goal is to, to make you aware of some concepts and, to trigger maybe some discussion as well. What do you think of all these developments? Because there's a lot of contradicting things going on in this view, because once you see some numbers and the research, you will see probably have a different view compared to the media narrative. So first of all, let me quickly introduce what's actually going on in the digital retailing industry and in our research cluster. So what you see here is these are the different directions and developments and disruptions happening in the whole transformative process of the retailing industry. We have from a consumer side, you see on the left top, the so-called channel hopping phenomenon. So that means the customers are actually hopping from one channel to another during one transaction process. So, entering a physical store, but buying the item actually at home or during their way to their homes via mobile phone, etc. We have the impact of digital technologies. It's a huge research stream. Digital technologies, as they can provide additional value more than above your items or your assortment you provide, your services. Think of augmented reality, things like IoT, sensors, beacons, and also from operational perspective, edge computing, fog computing, anything which is driven by emerging technologies. Along with that, we have the influence of and the relevance of big data. And this is a very, very interesting research stream as well, because it's significantly developing to a major component in retailers' business models. We have the development of the notion of customer experience as the new leading management objective for all retailers. So this popped up in research like 3-4 years ago, and in the industry even earlier. So customer experience as the biggest biggest objective to fulfill in order to survive in the business. We have, from an organizational view, we have the evolution of channels, as in how you shape your structure, your organization structure, in order to provide those, to meet your objectives and provide the superior customer experience. Today, we have the age of what is called the omnichannel approach. The omnichannel basically the integrated, harmonized, synergetic combination of all your channels with the customer in the center of all you're doing. So this is a very, very difficult and filled with challenges from many perspectives, as this is still, mostly an ideal scenario for a retailer. Competitors from the online world, they are entering the physical space. We know Amazon Go, Amazon Fresh. So this is also, causing a lot of disruption, because, the market boundaries between on and offline, they're dissolving, they're converging. So these have implications when you think of the different set of the assets and capabilities these players put on into the game, the data-driven decision makers from the online world versus, the physical customer experience driven retailers. And then we have what is the, in the center of this presentation is a phenomenon, what is called the retail apocalypse. And when you just screen randomly the news along Google, you will find these kind of headlines in those media, in any media outlet. So the notion of perception is negative, causing almost fear and anxiety, surviving the retail apocalypse. And thousands of stores has been closed, etc. And, it's getting darker and darker. This is what you will read in the media. So when I was in my scoping review phase, so obviously I noticed this as well. And I wanted to actually look into the numbers and observe what is actually really happening. So before I show those numbers, from a scientific perspective, there's no definite definition for the retail apocalypse term, but basically it refers to the increase in closing numbers and bankruptcies of large physical store chains, predominantly observed in the US. And the first thing scholars, would do is, investigate why is that happening. And current narratives are evolving around, the shift in consumer behavior towards e-commerce, and along with that, the growth, the relevance of that e-commerce. So it's a reinforcing phenomenon. You see major consumer groups are shifting. The new generations are more tech savvy, and the so-called digital natives are more motivated to get into the digital space. And other factors are discussed, like the demographic changes, structure changes. So like the mall anchor effect, for example, when a major retailer leaves a mall, the footfall drops significantly for the other retailers as well. Shrinking middle class, excessive retail space, and LBO, so leveraged buyouts as well. So looking at the numbers, so these are maybe a bit older numbers, so pre-COVID. So this is a pre-COVID setting of the numbers. I didn't have the opportunity to actually update those studies. And we see here, there's in this case, for example, there are closures announced as well as openings. And a list of major store brands are given. So which of those are actually opening and closing. So this is interesting. But once you take another study to contrast, you start thinking and you start observing, okay, there might be a pattern here. This is another one. It's, contrasting the opening ones along a brand, along the types, along the categories and the closures. And when you take another one, you start thinking, okay, there's actually a pattern observable, because just have a look at those categories and types who are actually opening. So it's dollar store, convenience store. In this one, it's Aldi, also Dollar General, etc. And those who are closing are consumer electronics, apparel, Toys R Us, Walgreens, Sears, Kmart. So is there actually a retail apocalypse? Is the first question, because we also observe openings, and in the middle one here is quite significant. So the relation, the imbalance. And there's in fact a study which shows that there's actually that the industry is actually growing. So there's more openings than closures. And then when you look at what I just mentioned, at the retail types, you notice that it might be true that there's opening and closure happening, but along probably, so that's the assumption, different retail types. So you see a real potential relation between what I would say low price oriented retailers with openings and high quality, high price oriented retailers with closings. And that motivated me to actually investigate what does the customer experience play in that, because the customer experience you can position along this dimension, high quality and low quality. So that was my motivation. So looking into that, so I don't want to get too much into the research aspects here. I want to focus more on the concepts as they are shown. So what I wanted to find out, so how can I position the customer experience orientation of a retailer in these numbers? Of course, the first thing I did was look into related work. And there is recently not going that much going on in this space. So it's heavily oriented on you know, quantitative measuring as, you know, sales numbers, etc., but not looking into some you know, multi-dimensional constructs such as customer experience, how to position that, or relate at the opening and closing. For example, on the right side, you see just what happens when there's a store closure announcement and some mediators, and then it signals to the investors with some distinct reaction at the end, there's an abnormal return. So quite quantifiable. So what I did, I tried to establish a link from the retail strategy, which is basically the formulation of what you have at the end as a retail format. So the retail format and the category is basically the manifestation and realization of your retail strategy. For this, I used the quite established framework, the competitive strategy framework by Porter, because it's really easy to apply. Differentiation and cost leaderships, and customer experience orientation is, as you're given a definition, is a multidimensional construct, which basically addresses cognitive, emotional, behavior, sensory, and other aspects. So I don't want to spend too much time on these details. So what I tried is to link, so this is a conceptual framework, to link those different concepts with theoretical components in order to make the statement, what you see here, that when you decide on your retail strategy, either on a cost leadership or in differentiation strategy, you would need to have a consistent alignment of 4 different decision variables, which are your customer experience orientation, your price orientation, your profit strategy, and your retail format. So here we have the distinction now, what we observed in the studies. So on the one end, you have the specialty stores, the department store, and the other one, the discount warehouse and supermarkets. And then now looking into how they would be in the reflect in their performance could give some insight, because on the one end, we have the customer experience orientation here. So that was the last status of what I was doing. And I looked into some descriptive numbers based on a database. So the data quality was not that good, as you know, you will be provided those data mostly based on, you know, company group data. For example, we know Inditex and Inditex Zara, but also they have a company such as a company like Bershka. And Zara and Bershka, they might be different in their positioning of their pricing, for example. So in that aspect, that was a weakness. However, what is shown here is that we can slightly realize that, you know, specialty, so high quality ones, predominantly showing decrease of stores. And another observation, which I did not expect, was, you know, we know the competitive strategy. There's also a third strategy. Actually, it's called the hybrid. It's a combination of both strategies. And this one was also interesting because a hybrid approach showed actually a superior return on investment compared to this small sample, compared to the other in this sample. That was also surprising. Anyway, so the idea was to follow the idea further with case studies and to actually learn more and explore about the deliberate strategy, why the closures are happening. Because you can also argue that closures are not just a sign of some weak management or profitability, but it could be also reshaping resource, you know, reallocating of resources or efficiency measures, etc. And this is the current state of that idea. And lastly, I want to make you point out some different, very, very interesting angle on the phenomenon, because it is always perceived as, okay, the retail apocalypse induced by the shift to e-commerce. So that's not always the case. There is this specific statement from Blaine Collar. So he had his one controversial speech at the Retail Excellence Dublin Conference once, where he argued that it's not always the e-commerce impact what's driving physical store chains to the bankruptcies. An example he gave was the Toys R Us example, and we know Toys R Us, they went bankrupt in 2017, which is, everybody knows those Toys R Us, now they're gone and actually bought up by Smith Toys Ireland, so all the retail stores. And he says that Toys R Us, they could not survive, could not service or meet the debt payments. And therefore they could not invest in their stores, they could not be innovative. So the money didn't flow into their innovation, it just flowed to paying debt, because they were taken over by a private equity company in 2006. And the reason, that's the reason why they would need to pay their debts compared to, thinking about how are we going to adapt to the changes through innovations. And he argues that Smith Toy, basically a similar business model is booming. And that's evidence showing the, that's the same business model on the one hand, is causing the demise of a large brand versus on the other side, a booming. And he argues that, concludes that it's not about the impact of e-commerce, it's more about running a business. So what I did, I actually made the effort to look into the data. So in this statement, and it's true. So what you see here is Toys R Us revenue development versus interest expense development. The red one representing the revenue development and the blue one interest expense. So interest expense is basically the interest is on your loans you pay back. This is because when they have been taken over in 2006, they were taken over by a special takeover technique, which is called leverage buyout. And that leverage buyout technique is basically characterized by a very, very small amount of own money from the takeover, from the private equity company, and a large portion of a loan, received by a bank. So the bank obviously expects that they're got interest to pay back. And this exactly showing when they started doing so. In 2005 and 2006, the whole interest expense relative to the revenue development, you see it's already, taking over all the revenue. They didn't have any chance to innovate, to, put money in any innovative aspect. They were, from the takeover moment on, they were just there to pay the debt back. And that's the difference compared to Smith & Toys. This was also something I wanted to share with you because I think that's really, really interesting to look also in the industry perspective of all this. And just small acknowledgement, of course, this is part of a huge European project we are in. And lastly, I want to just, closing my presentation, I want to make you aware of next upcoming events. Next week, for example, we have going to introduce the digital retail series, IVI webinar series, and starting with the topic of digital innovations in digital retailing. We have industry speech from Emer, and we have two researchers reflecting the analytics and the data integration part. And other than that, of course, I want to make you aware of we have the European Digital Retail Summit coming up on June 18th. It's free to attend. It's open for anybody. We encourage attendance from industry as well as academia. It's a huge opportunity for networking and potential collaborations. We have really nice lineup of speakers from SMEs to MNCs, from startups, from technology, from consulting, from customer experience and analytics, AI, startups, etc. From academic perspective, we also have the next WUDESHI-DR workshop announced, which is happening in October 28th and 29th. So we are covering a lot of emerging new topics. So I'm addressing the researchers among you, so feel free and ask the coaches for any information regarding this. And of course, please get in touch with our IVI social media presence, visit us on our webpage, and of course, don't miss to subscribe to our newsletter. I know I just took too much time on this. Sorry for that, but I hope I could give some insights into